Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
More than a dozen areas of England have restricted or completely halted IVF treatment since the start of the year in a bid to save money. Critics have warned that such decisions could lead to a postcode lottery for couples trying to have children. Well, 13 areas in England have restricted or stopped IVF treatment. Croydon is the first London borough to completely axe funding for IVF, while Redbridge, Havering, Barking and Dagenham will limit funding to just one embryo transfer. In the northwest of the country, Cheshire and Royal Vale have cut treatment from 3 cycles to 1. Treatment has also been cut to just 1 cycle in Swindon, while in Wirral it's been cut from 3 cycles to 2. And in the West Midlands, funding has been cut from 2 cycles of IVF to just 1 in Worcestershire. Well, our correspondent Joe Tidy is here now. And Joe, what's been clear is that there has always been an element of a postcode lottery to IVF treatment, but that it seems to be getting more extreme.
Yeah, I think this is the first time that we've really seen the disparity across England. This data has been compiled by Fertility Network UK, and what we're seeing is a real postcode lottery, they're calling it, depending on where you live. Increases or decreases your chance on having a baby in this way. Extremely disheartening, of course, for people who are trying to conceive in this way across the country, where you might live in a place where you get fewer chances than someone just over the county border, for example. Over the last 4 years, the number of clinical commissioning groups, or CCGs, in England offering 3 full cycles of IVF has fallen from 46%, by 46%, from 50 in 2013 to 27 this year. And as well as those 13 areas that we know have cut or cut down or completely cut IVF, we're also being told that there are further 8 areas that are looking to make cuts as well. Just to explain a little bit about what the cycle means. A cycle in IVF is where eggs are taken from a woman, they are fertilised in a laboratory, and any successful and healthy embryos are then put back into the woman, into the uterus, and hopefully you get a successful pregnancy from that. That is 1 cycle. So no matter how many eggs are transferred successfully to the womb, that is still the same cycle. If you wanted to do it again, that's a whole other cycle. So just to explain a bit about that. And the guidelines are very, very clear from NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. They say, having a look on the website, there's no grey areas here. If a woman is aged under 40, you should be offered 3 full cycles of IVF if you've been trying to conceive in the natural way for 2 years, or you have been unsuccessful with artificial insemination. And clearly, as Fertility Network UK point out, this disparity across England is breaking that guideline. And we have heard from the Department of Health, the spokesperson said, fertility problems can have a serious and lasting impact on families, and the NHS should provide access to services, including IVF, for all patients that meet the criteria set out by independent experts at NICE.
But Joe, the problem is, and the problem that the different health authorities will say, is the cost. And looking back to the 2013 figures, 50,000 women had IVF, 65 cycles. That cost £325 million in 1 year. It's an awful lot of money. And then we debated it last hour, there'll be people who say, well, actually, it's not a health problem in the same way that perhaps something like cancer is. Yeah,
and I suppose the difficulty is every single week we cover a story about the NHS losing funding or having to cut in certain areas, and some people will say that we need to prioritise where the money goes. It can cost around £5,000 to go private, and if you extrapolate that up, that's a lot of money that care providers are offering and spending. But the guidelines are there, so either NICE needs to change its rules, or these care providers across the country need to fall in line.
OK, Joe, thanks very much. Well, let's return to that news now that more than a dozen areas of England have restricted or completely halted IVF treatment since the start of the year in a bid to save money. Critics have warned that such decisions could lead to a postcode lottery for couples trying to have children. So is it right that the NHS should cut back on fertility treatment? Well, earlier we spoke to Simon Fishel, a fertility expert who pioneered IVF treatment in the UK, and the childcare writer Claire Byam-Cook.
Any form of rationing in the medical health domain is very difficult. It's difficult economically, it's difficult socially, and therefore it's always going to be painful however people decide that they're going to ration their funding. But I do think the first thing we need to do is get consistency in this country. It's iniquitous that you can live at the end of one street and get one type of treatment and not at the other street, and certainly in relation to infertility, because that is a very it's not a local problem. It's a national and worldwide issue that's pretty uniform. Secondly, I think if the NHS is going to spend its money offering IVF to some extent, it should look at who is doing the work, because success matters. Getting your, if you like, your baby for the money that you're putting into the system should be done as efficiently as possible. And thirdly, I would say we care about individual couples, of course, but there's another element to this. And the other element to this is actually the nation. We live in the West, sadly, particularly in the UK and elsewhere, in a declining birth rate. And what price a child, what value that child would give society. I think we have to look at also in the national context. We'd like to help couples have their own child, absolutely, and we wouldn't like to ration it, but we're going to have to rationalise some of the aspects of IVF as it does within the NHS in general. But the nation does still need an IVF policy, and it has to be consistent.
Yes, of course, it's really sad for people who want children who can't have them, and yes, it will affect, many of them psychologically. But some people look on it positively, and once they realise it's not going to happen, they try and adopt or they foster children. There are loads of children in desperate need of fostering. It's not always easy, but if you can't have your own child, as far as I'm concerned, it's sad, but it's not a medical condition that absolutely must be treated at the expense of other medical conditions. Many, many women don't even think about having children until they're at least 30, and it's not a lifestyle choice, it's because they haven't met someone. And so by the time they get to sort of 35 and perhaps realise it's not happening, and then to be told you've missed your chance, that's very tough. But as I gather, the reason why they've chosen that age group is because that's when IVF is most successful, and after the age of 35 fertility declines. So I think again it's just a financial hard-nosed decision on what is the best chance of success.
Women over the age of 35 are being denied IVF as budget cuts cause a huge collapse in the provision of NHS fertility treatment. Campaigners say that patients face big discrepancies between areas, which amount to basically a postcode lottery. We can take a look now at the picture across England in terms of IVF. 13 areas have already restricted or stopped treatment since the start of this year. Croydon is the first London borough to completely axe funding for IVF, while Redbridge, Havering, Barking and Dagenham will limit the funding to just one embryo transfer. In the northwest of the country, Cheshire and Royal Vale have cut the treatment from 3 cycles down to 1. Treatment's also been cut to just 1 in Swindon. In Wirral, it's been cut from 3 cycles to 2. And in the West Midlands, funding has been cut from 2 cycles of IVF to just 1 in Worcestershire. Our correspondent Joe Tidy joins us from West London now. So Joe, real example of a postcode lottery developing across England.
That's right, yes, and there's one woman who will tell you all about that, Isabella. Isabella, you just described yourself to me as a veteran of IVF. 5 cycles of IVF to get Charles, we can just see behind us there. And how old's Charles? Just tell us a bit about him.
Charles is now 4 years old. I started my IVF journey when I was 32 years old, and 2 years later we finally got Charles.
And that's quite a quick time, isn't it? It's quite a short period of time, really, because IVF can take a long time.
It can take a really long time.
I understand you had some problems at the beginning when you first went to your NHS, your local provider, and you said, I'd like to look at IVF, please.
Yes, absolutely. And I was incredibly disappointed and felt very let down when I was refused IVF on the NHS.
Why were you refused?
There were multiple reasons. A couple of them were that I had a poor sort of fertility prognosis, and in addition, my partner already had children. So those were the main reasons.
And that was a shock to you, I imagine, because
it was a huge shock.
As we know from looking at the guidelines, that the rules are, according to NICE, the National Institute for Care and Health, you should have IVF 3 cycles if you're under 40 and you've been trying for 2 years, and if artificial insemination hasn't worked out for you. So were you expecting to be offered 3 cycles of IVF?
Absolutely. I think there's very little clarity, and as you just said, one does expect to be able to obtain it from the NHS.
And what was it like for you going through that cycle 5 times?
It was very, very tough. It's extremely pressured going through IVF, and then in addition, of course, there are the financial pressures.
And I know your partner, he already had children, as you just described, but how important was it for you to have a family?
It's everything. I can't even say anything more than that, because it really is everything.
And obviously having a baby is a magical, miraculous experience anyway, but here he is now. Here's...
Can I climb up there?
Yeah, of course you can. We asked Charles to try and make sure he plays in a certain area, just asking permission if you can climb somewhere else. Very polite young man you've got there.
We try.
So understand, for you that having Charles has meant the absolute world. Speaking to other people who you know who have been through IVF and are having troubles because of this postcode lottery, what do you think about the idea of not having as many cycles in certain areas and cuts being made across the board?
I just think it really ought to be harmonised. I think, people, who are suffering with infertility are in a very, very difficult position as it is. They need clarity. They need to know what's available.
There's a spider?
Oh, maybe go to the
spider doesn't want to go on that
then.
bit. You can go on the swing, Charles, yeah. We don't want any spider problems. Sorry, you were saying to us, how you feel about this postcode lottery and how... I imagine you've got other people that you know who've been through a similar position.
Yes, I know many people who haven't obtained it from the NHS and have really had to scrimp, together to get this treatment, and have felt just as unsupported as I did in the situation.
So how much did the 5 different cycles cost you as a family?
The whole thing cost £50,000.
£50,000, right? Okay, yeah. That's that's a lot of money, isn't it? For
the
something that you'd have
vary.
thought would be yes. Is it £5,000 roughly?
Well, it depends on which clinic and which provider you go to. And again, maybe that's something that the commissioning groups need to be looking at. Are they buying as well as they can be? To make it accessible for all.
What do you make of the argument that we're hearing today from NHS England and some of the care providers who we're talking about that say that this is just a case of balancing books? They have to prioritise the money that they've got from government.
I think that at the moment, I believe 2% of all children in the UK are born via IVF. How will we do that if there is no funding? We do actually need more people, so how will we achieve that? And also just the moral angle, shouldn't everybody have a chance? And finally, the World Health Organization defines infertility as an illness. So I think they know what an illness is. I think it's reasonable to follow what they say, so it should be treated, I think.
Thank you very much for talking to us, and thank you very much to Charles for being the star of the show as well. So as you heard there from Isabella, there are lots of people around the country who are going through the issue of trying to get themselves IVF treatment. There are many couples there struggling to have babies, and if you're not in the position where you can go private, it is exactly what the Fertility Network UK say. It's a postcode lottery on whether or not you get 1, 2 or 3 cycles, but the NHS guidelines are that everyone should be given 3 cycles if you're under 40 and you've been trying for 2 years. Or you are unsuccessful in artificial insemination. But as we have heard as well from NHS England and some of the care providers, this is simply a case of the economics of the situation. It costs a lot of money to give people the option, and for some care providers, that's just too much money.
Joe, Isabella, Charles, thank you very much.
No one says it's easy to make spending decisions in the NHS right now, but among the unpleasant choices being made in parts of the country are cuts to IVF treatment. The NHS standard set by NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, is that women under 40 unable to conceive for 2 years should be offered 3 cycles of IVF treatment, and it's 1 cycle for those aged 41 or 42. But the group Fertility Network UK has found that almost half the areas in England have decided to breach that standard, cutting the 3 cycles to 2 or 1 or none in some cases, or changing the eligibility rules. With no NHS IVF, the only option is then to go private. Well, Elaine Dunkley's been to Bristol, where they're consulting on plans to restrict IVF to the under 35s.
Baby Finlow is Ellie's dream come true. At 39 and after years of trying to conceive, Ellie's first round of IVF was successful. Ellie was forced to go private and says the system is unfair for those who can't afford to pay.
We decided to go private because I was refused by the NHS because I'd had an early miscarriage, and they told me that I was subfertile rather than infertile, so they weren't going to fund it. Not being able to have a baby was absolutely horrendous. I know not all people this is what they want, but for me it was my absolute world. It was everything I wanted. And then to be turned down by the NHS and told they weren't going to help me was absolutely devastating. It's a lot of money, and I think for a lot of people that money isn't available. I was really fortunate that my family was able to help me, but I know not everybody's in that situation, and if we have to go for a second round of IVF, we're probably going to have to remortgage the house or get a loan.
Under guidance by NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, those aged under 40 with fertility problems should be offered up to 3 cycles of IVF. Those aged between 40 and 42 should be offered one if they meet a certain criteria. But this doesn't always happen. A cycle of IVF can cost in excess of £3,000. Decisions on who is eligible are taken by local clinical commissioning groups.
This is becoming a postcode lottery because of the way we commission in the UK. It doesn't have to be in that way because we have NHS England, for example, that has a national programme for our genetics associated with IVF. But the commissioning groups are able to not only decide whether they're going to fund IVF, but to actually provide restrictive eligibility criteria if they do fund it. So very few people get access to IVF that actually require it.
Some have described it as unethical, unfair and discriminatory, but ultimately it comes down to cost and whether the NHS should be funding the desire to become a parent when money is needed in so many other areas. 5 areas have now stopped offering IVF. Since the beginning of this year, the number of cycles women are entitled to has been reduced by 12 clinical commissioning groups. And in September, these areas will decide on whether IVF should be restricted to women who are 30 to 35, those most likely to conceive with treatment. One of those areas is in Bristol, the place where the world's first test tube baby was born. Mr. Valentine Accardi has helped thousands conceive and doesn't believe age should be the only factor.
That actually success rates are very reasonable until the age of 42. So yes, one can take an individual approach, and clinics do that all the time. Remember, infertility itself is also classified as a disease. That means there are some couples and some people where without help there is absolutely no way they will be able to achieve a pregnancy, and therefore they need medical help.
Every day the NHS is forced to make difficult decisions over what it can and can't afford. This is little consolation to those who feel time and funding is against them.
I think it's really unfair that people are treated differently across the country and that you've got the postcode lottery. I can understand that there's a lot of funding issues and they need to find ways to restrict it, but I think the way they're doing it is really unfair.
Elaine Dunkley reporting there. Well, we're joined by Professor Robert Winston, a world expert in fertility, one of the early pioneers of IVF. Also the freelance journalist Serena Bergman, who's written in The Independent today that IVF is costly and ineffective and it's time to stop offering it on the NHS. Robert Winston, you would argue that there shouldn't be a postcode lottery and the NHS should pay.
Well, thank you for putting my argument forward. That's helpful to start with.
Well, explain why.
No, I agree with that. Of course, there shouldn't. I mean, if we have a national health service, then it has to be national. At the moment, we now have local health services because of the reforms in the health service. And that leads to inequality, inequity.
And what's the right level to pay at? Is it what NICE have specified, 3 for women?
Well,
at
I
this
think
age?
3 cycles is reasonable. And, you know, with all due respect, there are a number of countries in Europe, for example, that offer free IVF and who have the similar cost for their health service that we do and are investing about the same amount. So it's not just shortage of money, it is actually a politically taken decision, essentially, by most of the commissioners.
Serena, why did you write that this shouldn't be a priority for the NHS?
I think it's something that I feel very strongly about. The NHS is obviously woefully underfunded, we all know that. And the NHS exists to keep us healthy. IVF isn't a cure to an illness, it's a solution for people who feel that they're not achieving their life goals. And I don't think that that's the responsibility of the NHS.
Serena, have you had children?
I don't see how that's relevant.
No, it's very, very relevant, because I'll explain why it's relevant. But you don't have to answer the question, and I don't mean to be in any way discourteous to you. But, you know, I've published hundreds of scientific papers, and you've very kindly called me a pioneer of IVF, which is probably an exaggeration. But, you know, of all my achievements, My 3 children are the things that change my life. They're the most important aspect because they're the next generation, and that's what we can contribute to. And people who are infertile suffer hugely. They suffer the pain just the same way as somebody with an arthritic hip or knee do. And at the moment, what is happening is that this is not being fully understood, and you should know better than that, I think.
Serena, fill in this. We're not going to ask whether you've had kids or any of those kinds of questions, but I am interested in whether you accept that the feelings people will have about whether they can have kids or not are as big to them as there may be for some of the other things the NHS spends money on.
Absolutely, that the feelings for the individual are incredibly strong, and my heart goes out to people who are unable to conceive naturally and want to. But I think we have a problem in this society where we consider that the best way to become a parent is by conceiving naturally and giving birth to a child. There are actually a huge amount of options for people who aren't able to conceive, and by putting so much money into IVF and presenting that as the #1 option, we're kind of not giving people the opportunity to explore alternatives. We currently have 70,000 children in this country who are being looked after by local authorities.
There's no children shortage, actually.
I'm afraid that adoption is not a treatment for infertility, Serena. And Serena, infertility is a symptom of a disease, and there are at least 100 different causes of infertility. And at the moment, what is happening is a massive wastage of money in the health service, because all sorts of investigations are being done, and you start the treatment, you give them 1 cycle, and of course you've then, of course, lost all that investment. And moreover, IVF is not being costed properly, because in some authorities it costs £1,000, in others in this country it costs £6,000. So until the NHS generally gets its act in order, there's a massive problem. And the problem really is that costing in the NHS is completely random. It's a really big issue. We've not costed treatment.
But Serena raises a point about why not encourage people to adopt? We've got children who are looking for
Because there are less than 1,000 babies that are able to be adopted a year. That's the trouble. And, you know, people do not unreasonably want to adopt a child who may have had very, very adverse experiences early in life. Most of the children that you're referring to have been in care for years, and they're not adoptable at the beginning of their lives. That's a major problem. And I certainly think it's a very, very brave person who's prepared to adopt somebody under those circumstances.
Serena, what is the point of NICE? Because actually we're having this argument, fairly amicable. NICE sit down and they work this out. They come up with a standard, they tell the authorities this is what we think is appropriate, and then the authorities just blasely go their own way and ignore it.
Yeah, I do think that that's a huge problem. It shouldn't be about where you live. You should know that if you go to your GP, you're going to receive the same care. That's the point of the NHS. But I also think that it's very telling that areas are making these choices. They're very difficult choices to make. It doesn't reflect well, but they know that they have to do it because we're facing such a huge crisis.
Else. Just very briefly, if you had to cut IVF services, you wanted to keep them but cut them, would you cut the age threshold or the number of cycles?
No, I would do IVF when it's really needed, and at the problem at the moment, at least half the IVF cycles are unnecessary. That's one of the issues. Right. Secondly, I'd want to cost it properly, and I would think, I mean, the work that we're doing now, the research we're doing can reduce that cost, and I think that's really urgently needed.
OK, need to leave it there. Thanks both very much indeed. Thank you.